finishing up with India, talking about colonialism and contemporary art. So colonialism in India, right, is linked, of course, to British colonialism, where Queen Victoria, right, names herself the Empress of India, and India is colonized, right, under the British crown. So one of the things I mainly see is a combination of the Hindu and Buddhist values here or styles, right, being combined, right, with Western style. You see a lot of imposition of Christianity happening, some suppression of the native religions, and of course other colonialist behavior that's per the norm. And so when we see different art pieces, like this portrait of one of the families that come to India, right, from Britain to live as basically, rulers. We see this interesting mashup or mix, right, of colonialist elements like the British dress mixed together with the native look or the native dress, and the native traditions sort of mixed together with the British traditions. In this painting, for instance, you have kind of this crossover that happens in the middle of the painting where the women sitting on the ground are holding one of the children, which kind of like collapses the divide between the two cultures. I believe very strongly that this painting was probably commissioned by Sir Elijah Impey, right, in probably the most positive manner. But again, you kind of look back on the painting and kind of suggest, ooh, is this in a sense, kind of trying to spectacularize the locals or take and use the local culture or tradition in the wrong manner, what we call cultural appropriation, right? So again, the sort of mix of the two. And then the child in the center, of course, sort of has sort of these Indian styled pants right underneath, right, the traditional British garment, right? So you see a lot of that mixing of the cultures, I think, start to happen in a lot of the pieces that you see. You also see paintings that show you the what could we put, imposition of British objects onto the Indian landscape. I'm always struck by this painting because it shows you kind of this wide open field right outside Calcutta where they build this British looking building basically as a governmental structure. But this idea of sort of tarnishing the landscape of the locals with this edifice, right, related to colonialism. There's a haunting quality to it. There's a strange quality to it whenever I look at it. And what's interesting is that type of, translation back to Britain itself, where if you look at the Government House painting, it's taking a British-styled piece of architecture and plunking it down in India. But then Queen Victoria, for instance, wanted Indian-styled architecture back on the British Isles. So this is actually the royal pavilion that was built back in Britain for the royal family that uses obviously very Indian styling. So it went both ways, right? And again, I've mentioned that, this idea of mishing and mashing, things together. You see this in a lot of the portraits where this portrait of the Maharaja, he has very traditional like headdress, jewels, but then he has like riding jodhpurs and boots on. He's sort of sitting at a table like with a typical Western still life. And then you have Captain John Foote, painted by Sir Joshua Reynolds, that goes again in the opposite direction where he's obviously a white British person wearing this ornamental, almost sultan-like outfit. So the colonialism that you see in Britain is this mixing together of the two elements, in a very sort of interesting and often uncomfortable way in a lot of ways. And you see this with a lot of colonial art. I also wanted to show you some contemporary artists with Indian heritage and background to speak a little bit about their work. This is Shazia Sikander, Pakistani, right, American, and she does a lot of work where she looks at what we call the miniature painting style. So miniature paintings were these, what they sound like, little paintings. They usually were found in books. And it's a very particular style that you see in Indian art, traditional historical Indian art. And so she actually did a whole project where she painted miniatures and then not so miniature, miniature inspired pieces, along with selecting objects from the Cooper Hewitt Museum in New York. The Cooper Hewitt is what we call a design museum, so it's all about design. And so Sikander was asked to come in and make objects to complement, in a sense, the collection. So I look at her work here. Cooper Hewitt is very similar to like Fred Wilson's work at the Baltimore Historic Society, where he used their collection alongside, he used their collection to create relationships. Here, Sikander is actually creating objects. So you'll notice the miniature in the middle. It's not a miniature, it's this huge painting. And then she basically picked out other objects to place near the miniatures. She said she then became very interested in miniature painting in general, the look of it, the style of it, and so she started experimenting a lot with it, whether she was actually doing real miniatures, which again were normally book-sized pieces, or larger pieces for like a museum context. She experimented with different types of materials. She used actually some tea to stain pages with the tea. So she used different spices and such. So she tried to work with materials that she said to her were linked to heritage from India. She liked the idea of the foodways, for instance, tea and spices and different things. So she made these different pieces. She then moved on to doing more installation art, as we call it. If you go back and think about like Carol Walker's work, it's installed in a specific space. This is why we call it installation. These are usually room-sized pieces or larger, and they're very what we call site-specific. They're specific to a certain place at a certain time, but they're literally installed in a place. And I always see people misspell this word. They'll call it installation. Notice it's based on installing something, so it's installation, right? Installing something. So don't make the mistake of misspelling it or missaying it. But she started to do these installations like the one you see at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Australia, where she would make these huge paintings on the walls, directly on the wall. She would do miniature paintings. She would do different drawings and such. This is a piece that she did for that installation called The Veil is Inspiration, where she was kind of working with the idea of veil wearing. So she's Pakistani, so she talks about, coming from a culture that's very Muslim in background. So she's like the idea of women wearing veils and, the idea of privacy and sacredness and playing with kind of all these different ideas. And lately she's gotten into video installation as well, and is playing with that and different types of video animation also. I also wanted to mention probably one of the most famous Indian artists out there, which is Anish Kapoor. And he's actually British, right, in background, British Indian. So he talks a lot about, like with Inkoshonabar, kind of being a blend of cultures, and talks a lot about colonialism and its impact. He started out doing works that were very steeped in Hindu mythology. Like I always reference like lingams and yonis, the idea of like penises and vaginas and the Hindu sort of mythology there, and sacred mountains and different things. And I love in his work how he creates this idea of ephemerality, because a lot of these early works he did were made with spices, and you'll notice they were made right on the floors of the galleries and such, and they weren't meant to be permanent pieces. So he said, I like to use a lot of color. He said, because if you look at like puja or worship in Hinduism, there's a lot of use of colored powders and spices and different things. There's a lot of colorfulness to it. He said, I like this idea of their ephemerality. They weren't meant to last forever. I love the name of these pieces, 1,000 Names. It sort of references like, the religion of 1,000 gods, this kind of idea. And then as he became more popular and got more traction, he started to do works that were about like existence and impermanence, reality and disreality, perception, what we see, what we don't see. Again, the bigger issues, I think, that go along with Hindu and Buddhist thought. His most famous work that probably everyone knows is Cloud Gate, or as it's commonly known, The Bean, which was created for Millennium Park in Chicago. And, one of the things he talks about with that piece is the idea that you look at it and, it refracts and reflects and, are you seeing reality or are you seeing Maya, One of his most famous shows was a show he did at the Royal Academy in 2009. He did these pieces with red wax. This is the one where he made where it was like a giant train of wax that went through the galleries. You can see the model in the top right for that piece. This cannon that was called Shoot the Corner that shot red wax out into the corner. And people ask me about these pieces, like, what's going on here? And I think what he's talking about is process, that life is process, it's a continual process of samsara and existence and circles and reincarnation. And often the answers aren't easy to find, that we're going around in circles where our life is about process. It's about trying to figure out what's happening to us. And this is a work he did recently, this swirling pool of water he called Dissension. He did this at a show in India, and in the background it sort of looked out to the sea. And I always kind of look at this swirl of water going around and him kind of suggesting again samsara, infinity, reincarnation, karma, and, the things that can't be understood, concretely. He's almost like, let it go, that everything is about the unseen, the impermanence, right? The lack of stability. And so his work to me is very much about the spaces in between and the interpretations that you have to make at the end of the day.